military devices.
Okay, let's
The
play some
Gospels follow
damn
those
shit.
sources more woodenly than, say, Plutarch does or Josephus does. So Matthew and Luke follow Q and Mark very strictly. They have more reverence for Mark than Josephus even has for the Hebrew Bible, which really shows you that the Gospel authors were trying to get their facts right. They weren't just making things up. They were really trying to follow what the data.
They weren't just making shit up.
The data they had in front of them.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right there, Michael. And what really strikes you, once you really get your hands around this stuff, and you're spending time in the text, and you say, okay, this is the way to paraphrase. This is what you're doing with refutation. This is what you're doing with all this kind of stuff. And you look at these compositional devices. Then, and once you become familiar with the Greco-Roman literature, and you see, like, Plutarch and what he does, then it's no longer the differences that strike you. It's the similarities, as you said. Because, as you said, Matthew and Luke stay much closer to their primary source, Mark,
You slut from China!
Josephus and Philo do to the scriptures. Even though they say they're not going to change the scriptures, they're not going to add to it or subtract to it, they do what we would consider in the 21st century add, subtract, and change. Now, maybe what they're talking about,
I still say that's a little dishonesty.
Right, and additions and subtractions. But they do far more in their editorial freedoms with Scripture. These two Jews do than what Matthew and Luke do with Mark. And you're right. I think that does show their reverence for Mark.
Yeah. Excellent. All right, let's get some super chats here really quick. Brett Williams, thank you for becoming a member. Same to Reginald Munford.
Bitch, suck my dick.
Quite a British name. Reginald Munford. Hey guys,
now fuck up and move that whore
why
right
do you
here.
think the indwelling of the Holy Spirit came only after the apostles laid hands on the Samaritans? I've come to some conclusions, but I'd like to get your thoughts. What are your thoughts on this, Mike?
I haven't really spent any time looking at that, so I really don't have anything to offer. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think this might be a time when this is the early church. The Holy Spirit is more active to get the church going. So we see a certain aspect where the Holy Spirit comes on someone and speaks and prophesies these kinds of things. And then once the church got going, this minimizes. I'm not saying it ended entirely. I'm just saying that there are other means as well. So I think that might be what's going on, but. Maybe check out Craig Keener's commentary on Acts for more on that.
Now buck up and take that.
Jephthah's daughter, I guess, in Judges. Burnt offering a perpetual virgin. I hope you're not paying Mike too much, loving his book on the resurrection, and want to see more. Great. Yeah, I used to take the perpetual virgin view, but Richard Hess says it was a burnt offering view. But the thing to remember is this is never condoned by God. This is in a time when the author of Judges is recounting all the evil that Israel is doing even under the judges. Like the judges are arranged in a topological fashion. So you go from good judge to less good to the worst. And like Jephthah's 7, I believe. So he's a really bad judge. And this is one of those examples. He's also a bumbling idiot in many ways when he tries to do diplomacy with the nation of a mom. So lots of issues there, but even either way, this is not condoned by God. Can I come to Thanksgiving or Shabbat dinner? Would be interested to sit at a family dinner with you and David Wilbur or Lycona. I'm a big fan. Well, David Wilbur and I live on opposite sides of the country, so we don't really have a lot of dinners together. And I typically just hang out with my parents. I'm pretty lame. I wouldn't suggest coming to my place for that. I don't know about you, Lycona, but I wouldn't be a lot of fun. I just like to eat and go to sleep on Thanksgiving.
Yeah, we usually have my son, daughter-in-law, and grandson over. If they're not working that day, they're first responders. And if they're not working that day, we'll have them over and just kind of kick back, maybe watch a little football, eat, have fun.
How big of an issue is the dating of Jesus' birth? Do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, most people think that it's 3 to 5 years before BC, let's say. You can't say before Christ. So 3 to 5 years BC is when he'd be born. To me, it's not really a stickler. I'm not a stickler on it.
Yeah, Michael Heiser actually argued that Jesus was born, I think, around 2 to 1 BC, based on dating issues. It doesn't matter because Luke only says he was around 30 when he began his ministry. I mean, you could talk about someone 34, 35, like that's around 30. So no, I don't think it's a big issue. I tend to go with like the 4 BC date, but I mean, like, I don't see it as a big issue there. All right, one more super chat. We'll take a break. What would you say to the objection that even if the disciples were killed for their belief in Jesus, there is no evidence they ever had a chance to recant?
Well, you look at it, and we do find early reports of several of them they're being persecuted. I mean, that's beyond doubt that there's so many reports of them being persecuted. Not only do the New Testament records report it, but so does First Clement. So does Tacitus. You find Josephus mentioning the stoning of James, the brother of Jesus, because he was considered a lawbreaker, which is something the book of Acts says, that the early Christians were regarded by the Jewish leaders as lawbreakers, breakers of the Mosaic law. So we find that this kind of course, Ignatius in the beginning of the 2nd century, he's marched off and executed in Rome. So you have all this kind of persecution that's going on. We have good reports about Peter's execution. Not only is that said kind of indirectly in First Clement, but the Gospel of John mentions the martyrdom of Peter because he's talking in present tense, but if John's written in the 90s, Peter's already been dead for probably 30 years, 25, 30 years when John's writing this, and he's predicting Peter's execution. So here's the thing. If you see in the book of Acts is any kind of, if it's accurate, which I think it is, and many have argued in that way, that if you see these people being persecuted and threatened with death, and then you start to see people like Stephen being stoned, James, the son of Zebedee, who is executed with the sword, and then you go out and you continue to preach the same thing that got the others persecuted terribly, imprisoned, and executed, then that means that you are willing to die for that same message, whether you do or not. Now, could some of them have recanted and it just wasn't recorded? It's possible, but possible doesn't mean probable. And you would think that since some of these early Christian writings, including the Gospels, including Acts, report some things that would be embarrassing to the early Christians, that they could mention something. I mean, they mentioned about Judas betraying Jesus, one of his own disciples, one of his 12 main disciples. So I don't know why they wouldn't mention something like one of them recanting. I think if you're going to say something, and I know Jalen isn't doing this, but if someone is going to say that maybe they recanted, they're going to bear the burden of proof to give some kind of evidence that this happened.
Yeah, I would just simply add, you don't need to even posit that. We just need to say, when the Neronian persecution broke out and everyone knew that Christians were being targeted, they could have just lied. But they didn't. They willingly professed Christ anyway, knowing what would happen to them. So they could have lied, they could have fled, and they stayed and professed Christ in a lot of ways. And even when they were captured, when they were interrogated, they don't deny Jesus there either, as best as we can tell from the available data. So it's not like we even have to posit they were given a chance to recant. We just say they refused to lie and continue to profess Christ as King. All right, we're going to get back to the literary devices in a minute here, and we'll get some more super chats. You guys put them in now. I will save them for later. But we're going to also look at some videos arguing that there was irrefutable contradictions in the resurrection accounts, and we're going to show how the literary devices easily solve these alleged irrefutable contradictions. But before we get to that, I want to talk to you first about inerrancy, because you got a whole section on inspiration in this book, as well as a section on inerrancy, and I really appreciate these chapters because this is the same kind of stuff I've been saying for years. We don't have this view in Christianity that the Bible is the eternal speech of Allah, like what Muslims would say. We say no, God worked through human authors. There is a human element there, something we do not deny. There are scribal errors. I have a video coming out this summer on 2 Samuel 21:19 compared to 1 Chronicles 25, and how there's a scribal error, and it's easy to explain. You just look at the available data, and I don't write on that. But so you talk about inerrancy in this, and you basically say we need to get rid of this modern understanding that the scriptures are inerrant. Now, anytime a person wants to get rid of that, they're going to clutch their pearls. What do you mean by that? What do you think we should? How do you think we should view the Bible? Go into that a little.
Well, yeah. Here in the United States and North America, there's a heavy emphasis on inerrancy. You don't typically find this overseas. It's mainly in North America. And what I've struggled with over the years is, I used to be a hardcore inerrantist. I'm still an inerrantist, but I define inerrancy differently. Some may not like how I define inerrancy, and that's fine. I even in the book I say I use inerrancy in nuanced terms, but I think other terms are better
take that rip.
than inerrancy describe the Bible. So I probably prefer other terms like inspired, infallible, authoritative, things like that. Reliable, trustworthy.
I like to use authoritative and reliable. Those are my two favorites.
Yeah, those are good. I just, when you take this hardcore view of inerrancy, the first thing we notice is that those who are promulgating it, it's like, all right, the Bible I'm holding in my hand is the inerrant Word of God. Well, hold on a second. We can point to numerous errors in the Bible, and in fact, even Norman Geisler and Thomas Howell in their big book of Bible difficulties. It's hard to get more conservative than Geisler and Thomas Howell. And yet they have all these contradictions or errors that they point out in the Bible. But they say a lot of these are due to copyist errors, and they're probably right in at least most of the cases that they're talking about. But they still acknowledge that our present Bible has errors in it. But yes, the people in the pew are thinking that the Bible they're holding in their hands are the inerrant Word of God, and it's not. Because when you look at definitions of biblical inerrancy, you find that it only applies to the autographs, the originals. Well, we don't have them. We haven't had them for a very long time. So in essence, you are affirming the inerrancy of text we don't have. I'm sorry. Yeah, you're affirming the inerrancy of the text we don't have, while denying the inerrancy of the text that we have. In essence, you have a firm grasp on an empty sack. And then you have to look and say, how do we identify a lot of the errors, at least those in the Old Testament, a lot of them? Well, it's because you have parallel texts between Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. And so we can kind of guess why a lot of these happen, maybe because of copyist errors. But most of the Bible doesn't have a parallel text. So we can't think that we have located all the errors. It could very well be, probably is, that there are errors in our current text that have no parallel text that we have no way of identifying.
Yes. So with that, how would you deal with the idea that means the Bible's not reliable? Because there could be filled with errors, despite that being a slippery slope fallacy. How would you deal with this whole issue? If we're going to say there could be errors, doesn't that mean the Bible's not reliable?
No, I don't think so. And it depends how you're defining reliable. If you're defining it in a really strict way that you are requiring precision, well, then you're going to have to say it's not reliable. But that's not how people really think about something being reliable. My wife can recount things very accurately. She has an excellent memory, but it's not perfect. But she's still reliable. I'll give an example. Well, I'll wait till later when we go through the Dan Barker tape to comment more. But no, I think reliable. I think we're looking for an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. And it's kind of like what you said earlier about the wedding. If you have a wedding and people are recalling things differently in a different order, if they're giving you an essentially faithful representation of what occurred, if you're getting an accurate gist of what occurred, then I think we can say that account is reliable.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And it's not this idea that if you have like scribal error, like I mentioned 2 Samuel 21:19 in the Bible. Therefore, you can't trust anything. That doesn't follow at all. That would be a slippery slope fallacy. That you can't do that kind of. We've got a ton of evidence for biblical reliability that I've discussed at length on my channel, that Dr. Lycona discusses on his channel, which I've also linked below, as well as a link to his book. So you can check that out. And I've got a series coming out this summer on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, where I'm going to argue that each gospel is reliable and goes back to the original author, and we're going to use various lines of evidence. So you can't make those kinds of arguments. Again, if you have the very strict fundamentalist view that it has to be perfect in every way, that's a problem. But we don't have to take that view. We don't have to take that view of inspiration. We don't take that view of inerrancy. So we need to be very careful, and I highly recommend you read Lycona's chapters in this book on that to get a better understanding of how we should understand inspiration and inerrancy, and start using more terminology like the Bible's authoritative, it's inspired, it's reliable, these kinds of things. But the church has acknowledged, going back to the church fathers, that there's a human element involved in the writing of the scriptures. God inspired people. He didn't like possess people and make their mouth move to talk to the scribe kind of thing. We accept that there was an inspiration aspect there. So God is working with humanity. He is not possessing people and just using them as puppets. We need to stop taking that view. That's not the historical view of the scriptures. Anything you want to add to that before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing about what does it mean to say it's inspired? What does theonos does in 2 Timothy 3:16? I don't think it means, divine dictation, although the term itself seems to imply that. And no scholars of which I'm aware would think that it's divine dictation. So what is it? What does it mean to be divinely inspired, God-breathed? And then when you look at the other verse, 2 Peter 1, verse 20 and 21, it says, no prophecy of Scripture is a matter of one's own interpretation, but men moved, carried along, borne along by the Holy Spirit, spoke from God. Well, that sounds like divine dictation as well. And it could be in that case because what it's talking about is prophecy of Scripture. Now, does that refer just to prophecies that later were reported in Scripture, or is it referring to all of Scripture? Well, some evangelicals would like to think it's referring to all of Scripture. I don't think so, though, because not only is it talking prophecy of Scripture, it says men moved by the Holy Spirit spoke, not wrote, spoke from God. So, and the Greek word that Peter uses there is pharaoh, which is very close to the words that Josephus and Philo used for how prophets received information from God. They were just carried along in such a sense that they are totally possessed by God, and they don't even know what they're saying because God is using their mouth to speak through them. That's more of what we're looking at with what Peter's talking about here. But then you get back to 2 Timothy 3:16. It's like, what does that mean? Well, you check what that verse means, that word means throughout other Christian and non-Christian literature. And there's an ambiguity, there's a vagueness there. I think at minimum it means that it derives ultimately from God. But to say that it means more than that, I think, well, now you're going out on a limb a little bit. You might be right, but you might not. So then what I think is you have to do is what Mark Strauss calls a bottom-up approach. And what F.F. Bruce, he doesn't call it bottom-up, but it's what he practices. You look at what Scripture is, the phenomena of Scripture. What do we have? Now, if you were looking at a divine dictation or something very close to it, like that's taught through the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy, then you expect a certain kind of text. Well, that's not the kind of text that we have. So you come up with different models of inspiration based on the text that we have. And I think what you're looking at here is what William Lane Craig calls the confluence of Scripture, the dual authorship of Scripture. And however that happened, whether God prepared that person in various ways throughout their life, or whether, as Bill that's what B.B. Warfield said, or whether it is God actualizing a specific world through his middle knowledge that knew that Paul would write whatever he did at that time. We don't know, but whatever model it is, it's a dual authorship where maybe God just instilled the concepts in the mind of an individual. But you can think of a number of models that would produce the scriptures that we have, and you don't even have to require that the originals be inerrant.
And now, just to add to that, people might be panicking. I can still see the fundamentalist mindset taking over. And the response to this is something you point out at the beginning of your book. We can argue the Gospels, the New Testament is incredibly reliable. And from that data, we can argue the evidence is best explained by what you talk about in your giant book on the resurrection, that Jesus rose from the dead. That's where the evidence points to. And if Jesus rose from the dead, game over. Christianity is true, even if there's an error somewhere in First Chronicles, or there's an error somewhere in Second Samuel because of the scribe. We don't have problems that other religions have, where we have to try to find ways to get evidence for religion. We have the resurrection argument, which is even Anthony Flew said it's one of the most powerful pieces for something supernatural. So, if Jesus rose from the dead, game over, Christianity is true, now what? So, I think it's great that you open the book with that, because all this stuff about what inspiration is, how reliable is this part or that part, is all secondary, because we have all the evidence for the resurrection, and we can argue for the resurrection. We have something that other religions don't have anything that comes close to, which is this data. So because of that, all this stuff is secondary, guys. There's nothing to worry about here. We can still argue from the data the Bible is reliable, that authoritative, and inspired. Anything you want to say on that before we move on to some other aspects?
Well, of course, I agree with you on that, Michael. But what I would add, if a person says, well, how do we know that we can trust? And Christianity is true, but how do we even know that we can trust what's in there? Maybe we know Christianity is true, but maybe we can't know anything about Christianity. Why should we even trust them if they've got some errors in it like this, even in the originals? Well, we wouldn't say that about other ancient historical literature, for one thing. They could still be trustworthy, they could still be reliable without being inerrant. That's one thing. But a second thing is, even if you take a hard-line view of inerrancy right now, and you say, yep, the autographs, the originals were inerrant, and what we have now, it's virtually inerrant, maybe you could say. Virtually inerrant. Then why is it that you can know that our present Bible has errors in it? Even errors, like I was saying, where there's no parallel text. I mean, we're not to think that the copyist only made errors when a parallel text was involved. And that being the case, then it's like, okay, well, there's probably plenty of other errors in it that we can never identify. So, how do we know that we can trust it? Why do you, as a strict inerrantist, still trust the Bible that you hold in your hands while knowing there are errors in it? Well, you do because you know that God, in His profound love for us, in His sovereignty, He still preserved a text that is sufficiently accurate for what He wants us to know. And so I would say the same thing under a more flexible view of inerrancy, which I would embrace. To say the Bible is without error in what it teaches. And in that case, whether there were errors in the originals or not is irrelevant, because the same principle applies, that given God's profound love for us and His sovereignty, He preserved a text for us that is sufficiently accurate for everything He wants for us to know.
I think that's a good way to put it. And so I appreciate it. I just want to remind people that this is not the end of Christianity. This is actually helping strengthen Christianity, because we are not assuming they're true and then circular reasoning. When we put it to the test, we put any ancient document, they come out to be incredibly reliable, the Gospels, that is. And then we can use that evidence to argue for the resurrection.
Mike, you also, add one more thing. You mentioned a little earlier the slippery slope. I just wanted to mention that when you're talking about a hill, the hill normally has more than one slope to it. And the other side of that hill is the slope where strict inerrantists can fall off, and the slope has a much steeper grade. Because when you place so much weight on a strict, a traditional form of inerrancy, and then you begin to see some discrepancies in the Gospels that you cannot reconcile adequately without doing some sort of hermeneutical gymnastics, that can really shake your faith, and you go tumbling down that hill a whole lot quicker than you think that we're doing when we're either redefining inerrancy or even don't prefer that concept any longer.
Yeah. I hate when Michael Jones looks at the camera because I feel like he's looking at me. I'm doing something wrong. I am looking at you, Trevor. I know exactly where you are, and I'm keeping a watch on you. So I just want you to be aware of that, Trevor. Don't think you can find the camera. I hit it very well. Do you guys like it when I look at the camera? Because I was told that that's better. Is it better? Should I be looking, at Mike? Because I look at Mike, this is how I would look. If I look at the camera, this is what I look like. So curious your thoughts on that. Nicholas Wheeler asks, why doesn't Mark go into more detail about the appearances of Jesus like Matthew and Luke and John?
Yeah, it's a good question, Nicholas. We don't actually know the answer to this. I mean, nobody does. Mark ends very abruptly in chapter 16, verse 8. Almost all scholars acknowledge that verses 9 through 20 were later added, that they weren't part of the original Mark. That's the part where they pick up snakes and drink poison and they're okay. So why does it end like that? Well, there are a variety of views, but there are two major views. Number one, Mark intentionally ended it that way. But the reasons that scholars have given for why Mark may have ended it that way, I mean, there's no end to it. There's so many different ones, and there's no consensus on any particular reason. The other option is that Mark did not intend for that to be the ending of his gospel, and then that splits up into two. Was the ending lost, or was Mark unable to complete the ending? So we just don't know. I tend to be in the latter category, that Mark, for some reason, intended for there to be a longer ending, but for some reason unknown to us, he was unable to complete the gospel, or that ending was lost. But Mark definitely knows of the appearance, because in chapter 14, verse 28, Jesus is predicting his death. And he says, after I have risen from the dead, I will go ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see me. And then when you look at chapter 16, verse 7, the angel says to the women, go and tell the disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of them to Galilee, and there they will see him just as he told them. So Mark anticipates the appearance to the disciples in Galilee. Why there's no narration of it in Mark's gospel? Again, it's hard to tell.
Yeah, I take the view that you recommended a book one time by Clayton Croy called The Mutilation of Mark. There was a longer ending that was lost, and then a later scribe tried to fill it in with the long ending we have now. So that's another possibility as well. My cousin wrote a book on Christianity and science being at odds is a historical myth. If either of you are interested, I'd be happy to send you a copy. Yeah, send me a copy. I'd be interested, Tim. Just email me through the website. We can get something like that. I'll take a look at it when I get time. It may not be for several months because I got a stack of books down there I'm trying to get caught up on. So thank you for gifting. And
Tim, I appreciate the offer, but I've got so much that I'm reading and doing within my own lane. I tend not to read books that are outside of my lane. I just have a limited bandwidth, and so I'd rather than tell you, oh yeah, please send that, I'd rather just be honest with you and say I'd probably never get to it. But it sounds interesting.
Thank you for gifting an Inspiring Philosophy membership. I still have people asking how they can become members. There's a join button below, or you can become a Patreon at patreon.com/inspiringphilosophy. You get early access to videos, including the video out now, which is Luke Vandewey's newest paper coming out, where he's using a mathematical analysis on the names in the Gospels to show they are incredibly reliable. That video will be out soon. I promise you this is groundbreaking and should continue the conversation in that area. So yeah, it's very interesting stuff.
Luke's a good scholar.
Yeah, he's great. He's been helping out a lot of the videos I have coming out this summer as well. So, is it hypocritical to dismiss the minimal fact hypothesis on criteria like ad hocness and then propose 100% ad hoc harmonization, e.g., Judas's rope snap?
Is it hypocritical to dismiss minimal fact hypothesis on criteria? I'm not clear what William is asking here. Maybe you could help me with that, Michael?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a lot of the people that take harmonization routes don't even like the minimal facts hypothesis.
Oh, okay.
So they're not. Is it hypocritical to dismiss minimal facts on criteria like ad hocness and then propose? You know, I'm confused by it as well. I'm not entirely sure of the argument here. I don't think it necessarily is, but we need. This seems like it'd be more of a conversation over a beer. This is not something that you can really flesh out in a super chat. There's more here that I would need to ask like multiple questions to get a better answer. I don't think it is. If I'm understanding the question properly, people that hold to maximal facts do harmonization, so they don't even like the minimal facts. People that hold to the minimal facts hypothesis don't do a lot of the harmonization aspects. So I think these are just two different groups of people that don't really have a lot of overlap.
I guess I could say to that I've got a friend named Sharon Elander. She's a former student of mine, brilliant woman. And we were talking about this thing about Judas one time, within the last year actually. And she proposed something that I think is quite plausible. It's the best answer that I think I've ever heard. So, of course, Matthew says that Judas hanged himself, and then Luke, it says that he fell headlong and his gut burst open and his intestines came out. So that does seem to be a contradiction. But some people try to harmonize that and say, yeah, the rope broke and whatever. But you know what? If the rope broke or the branch broke, he wouldn't fall headlong. He'd fall butt-long. The butt first is what he would fall. He hit his butt before. Well, maybe he hit his butt and then he tumbled down the hill head first. And it just gets to be kind of ridiculous. What Sharon said was maybe when Axe reports that his gut burst open and his intestines came out, that maybe this was a later part. Maybe this was on his way to being buried. They'd taken him down, and as Papias talks about, he falls off. Papias, or another ancient Christian writer, he was on a cart and he fell off and then he burst open. So it could have been that he hung himself. And then after he was, maybe he was on there for several days, his body was bloated. They took him down, they put him on a cart, and either he fell off the cart or when they were dumping him into wherever the field to bury him, it's at that point, so his body, it split open and his intestines came out. And then it's just that Acts just omits the hanging part and just goes with more or less the portion of the burial.
That's so much.
Now you say, well, that sounds ad hoc, but I think it's plausible. You've got Luke in chapter 9, verse 51, who says, when the time was approaching for Jesus' ascension, he was determined to go to Jerusalem. What? You just mentioned the ascension? Well, what about the death? What about his resurrection? Why aren't you just, Luke doesn't deny the death and resurrection. He's just mentioning the ascension at that point. And this could be what Luke is doing in Acts as well, when it came to the burial of Judas. I really like Sharon's answer there. Again, I think it's probably the best that I've heard.
Has she written a paper on it?
No.
Oh, fiddlesticks. Oh well. That'd be nice to see have something published on that. That'd be great. All right, we're gonna get back to the literary devices. We're gonna look at this. So again, Muslims and atheists often make the argument that the resurrection accounts in Matthew, Mark, and John are hopelessly contradictory. So I'm gonna put a video up here, and then we're gonna play a video by Dan Barker just to kind of get an idea of what they're getting at. I have a video from a Muslim, but his mic's horrible, and he's talking fast, so it's hard to really follow him, especially in the stream. But Dan Barker makes basically the same argument in his own video. So we'll add a little bit. We'll play a little bit of his video, jump to the Dan Barker video, respond, and show how using literary devices shows there's no contradiction here. This is easy to sort out. So
the Bible is irrefutable and no one can refute it.
So right there, he says it's irrefutable, Mike. No one can refute it. No one can. Definitely not you. You definitely can. Even though you've written on this so many times.
That's easy closest to you. So here are the four gospels side by side about the resurrection of Jesus Christ and how the women found the tomb and Jesus' resurrection. And these stories are entirely different. Let's start with John 20. We have Mary Magdalene alone, and she walks into the tomb. She notices the stone had already been moved when she came. She runs to Peter and said, "We have taken the Lord out of the tomb." Peter and what do you call it?
You notice something a little weird there to start with, Mike. We're talking about John's account. She says, Mary, let me play that again, so let me just make sure we got what he says here.
Let's start with John 20. We have Mary Magdalene alone, and she walks into the tomb.
He says, John reports, Mary was alone. Now, I don't know about you, but I did notice there's a verse right in front of us on screen where Mary said, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. Does John say Mary was alone?
No, I think this is a case where he is using what you referred to earlier as literary spotlighting. He knows that there are others present, but he's got his focus on a single person, in this case Mary Magdalene. Perhaps she's the source for the story. So for whatever reason he's only mentioned, but it seems that he's aware that there are other women who are with her, because she says we. And she's probably not referring to the beloved disciple and Peter, because of course they wouldn't know. 5 seconds before, they didn't even know the tomb was empty.
Yeah, and I love how that part's not highlighted. Like, let's just ignore that important aspect right there that kind of debunks the whole argument.
And by the way, literary spotlighting, this isn't some kind of a desperate move here. Literary spotlighting, when I was going through Plutarch's lives and comparing how he tells the same story differently, literary spotlighting was used more by Plutarch than any other compositional device that I saw.
Yeah, I did notice that in your book, and that is... Guys, that's just what the gospel authors are doing. Matthew's not saying these are the only women who went to the tomb. Neither does Mark, neither does John. They're just spotlighting. And again, read through Plutarch's life. You'll see spotlighting all the time. So this is, and we do something similar today. Like if I report I went to the wedding and I talked to my brother, he had a great time, it'd be ridiculous for you to say, well, you didn't mention the bride was there. Yeah, because it was irrelevant to maybe the conversation I wanted to highlight between the groom and myself, that kind of thing. So you can't assume that just because they don't mention literally every person involved, there's a contradiction. That's not how this works. So, as I mentioned, his video is a little hard to hear and follow because he's talking really fast at times. I get it, sometimes it's hard to go through this kind of stuff. But Dan Barker makes a very similar argument, and it's just the same objection we've heard before. It's going to highlight a lot of the same stuff. So let me put something on screen here before we get to Dan's video, just so you guys can see. This is a graphic that atheists often use. You look at like these kinds of things. They'll say, how many women went to the tomb? This is who Matthew says, this is who Mark says. And I like, under the John category, what do we have? Only Mary Magdalene, again, lying about what the verse says. Doesn't say that. When did they go to the tomb? Daytime or nighttime? When did the women see an angel roll away the tomb? Did a young man sit on the side of the tomb? 2 men in shining garments? Mary Magdalene saw nothing but a moved stone? What was said? I could just hear Barker saying, it depends on which gospel you read. Did the angel say Jesus had risen? Did a young man say Jesus had risen? Did 2 men say Jesus had risen? Nothing is said about Galilee in John, so clearly they contradict. Same kind of thing here. This is the common argument you hear from them, that all of these contradict because they don't say the exact same thing. Anything you want to say to that, Mike, before we move on?
I'd say when you hear someone say, just a general observation, when you hear someone saying, they cite these differences between the Gospels, and then they say, see, the Gospels are hopelessly contradictory, they're irreconcilable, and therefore they should not be trusted. What that tells me as a historian is that person is not a serious student of history. And the reason I say that is because You take just for example, Nicholas Horsfall is a classicist who's written an article about the assassination of Julius Caesar. And he says on that fateful day of Caesar's death, there is more information about written that day than there is for any other day in Roman and Greek history. And he says because of the massive amount of information, there are abundant variations and inconsistencies. But no classicist is going to turn around and say, well, when you look at Appian, Cicero, Dio Livy, Nicolaus, Plutarch, Suetonius, and Velleius, who mention this event, and Plutarch in 4 of his lives, that it's hopelessly contradictory, and therefore these are utterly unreliable accounts, and we just shouldn't trust any of them. Of course they're not going to do that. And there are a number of reasons why you have these kind of discrepancies. We can go through a bunch of them, but just as an overall thing, when it comes to something like the assassination of Caesar, there was a lot that went on that day, right before the assassination, that morning, what was delaying Caesar, the sacrifices that took place, the portents that were there, the setting up of the assassination, what was said, who struck where, and what was said after, and then what happened in the immediate aftermath for the rest of that day. There's a lot that's going on, and it's going on rapidly. So there's emotions, there's shock, there's fear, all this kind of stuff. And just like any conversation where you're going to repeat things that you heard just 20 minutes before, and you're repeating it to someone else like your spouse or a friend, you're not going to remember the precise order, but you're going to remember certain things, and you're going to weave it in your recollection of that conversation, how you recall it. You're going to weave it in there in a cohesive manner. And that's not to be considered hopelessly contradictory. So the same applies to the Gospels, because they are biographies of Jesus reporting historical events. And so you have things like, did the temple veil split before Jesus died, as Luke reports, just before it, or just after Jesus died, as Matthew and Mark report? I don't know. And probably because events were just so, shocking and difficult, and some of them to know exactly when it would have done it. They just knew the temple veil split, and they just wove it into their narrative where they saw fit. We just know the temple veil split. Then you've got sayings of Jesus, like people say they want to follow Jesus. And that's where Jesus says, well, foxes have holes, birds have their nests, but the Son of Man doesn't have anywhere to lay his nest. Oh, Lord, but I want to follow you. But let me bury my dad first. Let the dead bury their dead. You come follow me. And so where did Jesus say that? Well, Matthew puts it at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, on the evening that Jesus had healed Peter's mother-in-law. But Luke places it toward the end of Jesus' ministry, on his final trip back to Jerusalem. So it was something that was known that Jesus said, but the gospel authors just, they didn't know where to put it. They just wove it into their narrative at a cohesive spot. There's no footnote that would say, well, we don't know exactly where this went. It's just, we're putting it here because it fits. They don't do that. Their responsibility was to write a cohesive, nice, flowing narrative, and that's what they did. And of course, you've got the Q sayings, right? That's a collection of about 200 sayings or so, something like that. But they're not really tied to any kind of context. And so you have Matthew and Luke just placing them peppered throughout their Gospels in different spots. There's no particular order of them. So that was fine to do. Do we call that unreliable? No. So I think that this just shows when someone says they're hopelessly contradictory, you can't trust them for anything, they just haven't studied any kind of history outside the Bible. Because if they did, they'd have to say, we couldn't know anything about the past.
Yeah, it would be. I think Dan Wallace once said we immediately go back into the Dark Ages. We eclipse all knowledge we know about the past. So, all right, let's put over the Dan Barker video, because he's going to bring up a lot more of these issues with the resurrection account.
Christians present one of the biggest evidence for God is the empty tomb of Jesus. Jesus rose from the dead. History proves it. You read the New Testament. But that's the worst example anyone could possibly give for the reliability of the Bible. The 4 or 5 resurrection accounts that are given in the New Testament are hopelessly contradictory. Even conservative scholars agree that they cannot be reconciled. The Bible is not a source of truth. It was written by a bunch of perhaps well-meaning but ignorant ancient people who had religious ideas about spooks and ghosts and all that. And they thought actually dead people could come back to life. When in fact, the New Testament doesn't say that. The New Testament doesn't say Jesus bodily rose from the dead. Let me ask...
Now, Mike, I'm not sure if you've ever written anything on this, but does the New Testament say Jesus bodily rose from the dead?
Yes.
Yeah,
pretty clear that it does.
Yeah, and I love the circular reasoning there. We know people don't come back from the dead, therefore these have to be false, because we know people don't come back from the dead. It's just circular reasoning. You're assuming naturalism is true, and when you do that, you're going to get the conclusion you want, which is that Christianity is false.
I do.
Yeah, you're weighing in with your worldview, not the data.
Ask you. There's 4 or 5 accounts of the resurrection in the New Testament. The New Testament gives contradictory answers to all of these questions. What time did the women visit the tomb? Was the sun shining or was it dark? Take your pick.
Take your pick, Mike. Talking about Mark and John specifically. So Mark says, after the sun had come up, they went to the tomb. John says, while it was still dark. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I like to watch sunrises and sunsets. I really do. I just think they're inspiring, and I love it, especially at places like beaches and different places. So I love watching sunrises and sunsets. And anyone who goes out and watches a sunrise or sunset knows that there's like that 10 minutes, that span before the sun rises and just after it rises. There's a lot of difference in the way the sky looks, and the amount of light that's coming out. So could it be that, John is reporting it early in the morning while it's still dark? Mary gets up and goes to see the tomb. Is it talking about what the sky looked like when she left her house? Whereas Mark is talking about what the sky looked like when they arrived at the tomb. So I think that's not really a big problem. But even if you do have a big problem, we're back to what I just said. My overall general observation at the beginning, or just a few moments ago, that these things are happening rapidly. Was it still kind of dark out? And what does dark mean? Does that mean pitch black, or does it mean it's not quite daylight yet? That the sun had risen, had just been up for 5 minutes. What are we talking about here? It's not really a problem. But even if that's the case, it's like, well, it was early morning, and that's what's important.
Yeah, I've been to sunrise. It's still dark. It's not perfectly light. I mean, when looking for turning on the oil into a mouth.
Who were the women? Different lists. What was their purpose? Different purposes. Was the tomb open when they arrived? What do you think? Yes or no? Both. In Matthew, the tomb was closed, and it opened after the angel came with the earthquake. Where were these?
So let's talk about this one, because this is the big one I hear from Muslims and atheists. So Matthew says the tomb was closed when they got there, and then an angel comes down and opens the tomb, whereas the other gospel often say it was open.
Yeah, I don't think that's crystal clear that it was still closed when they got there.
Yeah.
So I don't think that there's real clarity in that. So if that's going to be their main one, I would encourage them to look for a better one.
Well, I mean, you mentioned Matthew simplifies things. Matthew just seems to be just giving the overview of what had happened. He doesn't say this happened right in front of the women watching. He simplifies, summarizes these kinds of things. So it very well just be the case. Matthew is saying, when the women got there. So it says now after the Sabbath, towards the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to the tomb, and behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven, came back and rolled the stone and sat on it. So his appearance was like lightning, and his clothes was white as snow. He may just be giving the backstory of how the tomb was opened. He's not necessarily saying this happened in front of the women. So he does not ever say, when the women got there, they saw that it was closed. And then this angel came, that's not what he's doing. He's probably giving a simple summary there. All right, let's play a little bit more here. Who is at the tomb? Different accounts. Where were these messengers situated? Different accounts. What did the messengers say? Different accounts. All right, so let's talk about the messengers, the angels that are there. So they're in different places. Some say standing, sitting. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I mean, you can kind of work to try to harmonize and make this work, and maybe that can work in a sense by harmonizing. I'm not against harmonizing. I'm open to it. I don't necessarily see something here other than simplifying. Could it be that the angel that after he rolled back the stone and sat on it, and the guards were there and dead because they're terrified? Then the women arrive, they see the angel, and he says, he's not here, he's risen. Come see the place where he lay. Maybe at that point the angel gets off the rock and walks in the tomb. It doesn't say that, but you don't have to be talking about every detail. And Matthew, none of the gospel authors are thinking that any of their accounts are going to be examined under a microscope like we're doing here. So they're not trying to say, well, I better say that he got off the stone and walked in the tomb, or someone might write something afterward that gets me in trouble here. Was there one angel or were there two? Matthew and Mark have one, Luke and John have two. I think this could easily be a case where you have spotlighting going on, and they're just talking about the one that's mentioning that he's risen. Again, this was the most frequent compositional device that I saw in Plutarch that Plutarch used.
Yeah. Did the women tell what happened? Yes and no. When Mary returned from...
So real quick on that one, that's about the short ending of Mark, where Mark says they went away afraid and told no one. And you addressed this. I did a short video on this as well that I remember you reviewing. You addressed this. This just seems to be Mark the way he sort of talked about stuff. And anything you want to say on that?
Yeah, in Mark 1:44, Jesus had healed a leper, and it says that let's see, it's been a while since I've mentioned this. Does Jesus tell him? He tells him to go back and say nothing to no one. Same grammatical structure as the angel uses here.
I'll read it for you. It says, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest."
Right. So that just meant don't stop along the way and talk to someone. Just go directly to the priest and show yourself to him. Well, I think that's what's going on here. Because if that were the case and they said nothing to no one, then how does Mark even know about that?
And again, if Clayton Croy is right, there was a longer ending there that was just lost, so there's that issue as well.
From the tomb, did she know Jesus had been resurrected? Yes and no. When did Mary first see Jesus? Could Jesus be touched after the resurrection?
So, the one about when did Mary first see Jesus after the resurrection, this seems to be an issue between Matthew and John. So Matthew says that they left the tomb and they met Jesus on the way. John says they went, they told Peter, John, and they went back to the tomb, and that's when Mary sees Jesus. So what are your thoughts on this? Because this is another big one they bring up.
Yeah, this is one that I find very difficult to reconcile. I don't know what's going on there, Michael. Either Matthew or Luke doesn't have it right. Maybe Matthew has changed it for some reason, or John has changed it. One of them just isn't reporting just like it happened. I don't know who it is. But it's very difficult to reconcile.
You mentioned the literary device of transplanting. Like you could transplant events at times.
Yeah.
I tend to say that's probably what Matthew's simplifying and transplanting. It's very, maybe John's giving a more detailed account, but leaving out the initial conversation that the angel has. Maybe, and then Matthew doesn't want to narrate this running back and forth kind of thing. He wants to just get it done. So he just transplants, which is another literary device you bring up, on there instead of having it this whole chaotic thing going on that John narrates.
Yeah. It could be. Matthew could be simplifying It is different, though. I mean, you do have Mary, she's hanging behind at the empty tomb after Peter and the beloved disciple leave in John's Gospel. And it's at that point that she's weeping, and then she stoops inside the tomb, and, all that. And Jesus on the outside saying, "Why are you weeping?" And that's where she sees him at the tomb, like you say. But in Matthew, it's after they're running away to go tell the disciples, and that's where they meet Jesus. It's a tough one. I mean, maybe Mary Magdalene met Jesus at the tomb, as John reports, and then she starts running back to tell the disciples, and the other Mary was coming out and kind of intercepted Mary Magdalene along the way, and then they start to go and run back to tell the disciples, and that's when Jesus meets both of them. And it makes it sound in Matthew like Mary Magdalene is seeing him for the first time, but maybe it's the second time, and she's just excited to see him again. I don't know. I just don't want to engage in some sort of tortured harmonization, but I also am recognizing, again, in my 60-some years of living, that sometimes there are things that seem irreconcilable, but then when you get the full story, it's like, wow, yeah, they do fit together.
Yeah. Well, let me give you something here. This was in an older video I did. There's actually a way you can reconcile all of these quite easily, just using what the Gospels say. None of them say only this thing happened. So let me put this up here real quick. This is in the video when Jesus appeared to the women. And in a lot of this video, I go and explain a lot of the literary devices, and then I offer the simplification explanation at the end. But here's another way where you just take what all the Gospels say. Some Christians respond by trying to harmonize the accounts in a way that preserves all the chronological aspects of both Gospels. Perhaps what happened is the women went to the tomb and found it empty. Mary Magdalene was so distraught, she ran ahead to the disciples, leaving the other women behind. Then the angels appeared to the other women that remained behind, and then they went to deliver the message to the disciples. On the way back, Jesus appeared to them. Meanwhile, Mary, John, and Peter ran to the tomb but took a different way, thereby missing the other women who were looking for the disciples. Then Peter and John left, and the angels of Jesus appeared to Mary alone. So that's in a simple video I did a while ago, I think like 2 years ago or something. But so basically it's the idea you can actually, as you mentioned, look at this frantic morning when people are running around trying to figure out where the body is. What Matthew, John, Mark, and Luke say all fits together in a neat little explanation. Now, in that video, I was a little bit hard on it, and I kind of agree with him now. I think it was a little too hard. That does work. You're not adding any additional assumptions in. But I also noticed this at the end.
I'm not sure that does work. Because Matthew, doesn't it say that he appeared to Mary Magdalene and the other Mary?
Let me check. It says, so they departed quickly from the tomb, ran and told the disciples, behold, Jesus met them and said, greetings. And they came and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. And Jesus said, do not be afraid, go.
Who were the two women?
I think it's Mary Magdalene and Mary.
The other Mary.
Yeah, in the beginning. And so I think what they're trying to say is maybe Mary left at some point, and the other women that, Luke and Matt and Mark mentioned were there as well. So they're just trying to harmonize it. But again, I like what you say here in the book. You say Matthew is compressed elsewhere when he narrates the centurion goes, Jesus petitioning him to heal his servant, rather than sending two separate sets of emissaries, never seeing Jesus himself as in Luke. However, the resurrection narratives in the synoptics have not been conflated and greatly compressed. Why is the initial appearance of the angels to the women absent in John? Matthew and the synoptics conflated and compressed elements in the narrative of necessity. I think that's key right there. They would have needed to redact other elements in order to improve the flow of the narrative. Which again, just using literary devices, you get a simpler explanation, which I discussed in that video, where it's not that complicated. Basically, you just have Matthew as conflated, compressed, translated some things in order to just make his narrative flow simpler, which is one of the things he really enjoys doing.
I like what that dude says. I kind of forget some of the stuff over time because there's just so much. Mike, I really like your animation stuff. You do such a great job with that, and it really simplifies things and to be able to see them there, and how you illustrate. Man, you're just doing great work, brother.
Thank you. To be fair, that wasn't me. That was an animator I hired.
Okay.
No. So yeah, that was. I don't want to take credit for that.
Well, I do the other animations that you do in your videos, and you do a good job on them.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. So right then and there we have two explanations. We can just harmonize it all in the little animation you saw. Or just take it, what I would say is a more parsimonious explanation. Just simplify it using literary devices, which we know they use, which we know is in the culture, and we know this would be the common thing that humans do when we're telling stories. We want to just make it simpler for the audience. So another simple way to just deal with that. All right. Let me
give you an example of something that I find kind of interesting. So there's a story of Julius Caesar that when he's in Spain, that Plutarch reports that he is reading something written by Alexander, and he breaks out in tears. And the people with him say, "Why are you crying?" He says, "Well, because I'm recognizing that when Alexander was my age, he had conquered the known world at that point, and I've hardly done anything with my life." Now Plutarch, he reports that happened after Caesar finished his leadership in the year 62 BC. But Suetonius and Dio reports that Caesar said that when he was in his quaestorship. And that was in 69-68 BC, 6-7 years earlier. So and another thing, Plutarch says that he broke out in tears when he was reading something Alexander had written, whereas Suetonius and Dio says he began crying when he saw a statue of Alexander. So what's going on here? Obviously, there's some discrepancies here. It's probably not both occasions that this happens. And Christopher Pelling suggests that Plutarch has changed things, like the timing to the right after his praetorship, which was a higher position than a quaestorship, in order to bring it closer to the time when Caesar's ambition for power was really to take place. So that's kind of interesting. So you have the timing of it, plus the fact he was reading it rather than seeing a statue of Caesar. Of Alexander, I'm sorry. So yeah, these changes, they could have been errors, they could have been intentional. Pelling thinks that they were intentional to make certain points.
Yeah. All right, let's get back to the Dan Barker video. We'll finish it out, and then we'll do some of your super chats.
After the women who did Jesus first appear, different stories.
So that's what we just looked at. And so, again, different approaches, harmonization, literary devices, both of them I would say work.
Where did Jesus first appear to the disciples after the resurrection? Different stories. Matthew said it first happened in Galilee, which was 60 to 100 miles away. But John and the others say no, it happened somewhere in the road to Emmaus or Jerusalem.
No. What are your thoughts on that? Where did Jesus appear to the disciples? In Galilee first, or in Jerusalem?
Yeah, so we're talking about his group of male disciples. And Michael, I gotta say that this is the second. You have two of all the differences in the resurrection narratives. There are two that I think are very difficult to harmonize. One being the one we just discussed, where Jesus first appeared to Mary Magdalene. The other is this one here. When you read the account in Mark and in Matthew, the angel is very clear when he says, he is going there, and the Greek word appears first in the sentence there, which means there for emphasis. It is there in Galilee that you will see him.
Do you think it could be that just, they're again simplifying the account, leaving out certain things, kind of thing? It seems, again, I think you mentioned some of the literary devices. It could just simply explain they're just trying to improve the narrative flow.
When it comes to Luke, Luke is certainly using compression. Luke places the resurrection, all the appearances, and the ascension on Easter Sunday. Whereas in his sequel, Acts, in the first few verses, he says that Jesus appeared with them for over a 40-day period. So Luke is well aware that he was with them more than just on Easter. So Luke is compressing in his gospel. That is crystal clear. But you do have John that he has them appearing to his group of male disciples on Easter in Jerusalem. So the question for me would be is why is the angel saying, there in Galilee you will see him? And Mark, the angel says that there you will see him. He's already gone ahead of you. He is on his way to Galilee now. And it's there in Galilee where you will see him, just as he told you back in Mark 14:28 before he was even killed. And then in Matthew's gospel, the women bump into him as they're running back, and he says, yep, go back. And he reiterates what the angel had said to them. I am going ahead to Galilee. Tell them to get to Galilee. There they're going to see me. And that's where the group, the first appearance to the group of male disciples occurs in Matthew's gospel. So it does seem that both the angel and Jesus are saying the first appearance to the group of male disciples is going to be in Galilee, and that's the way that Matthew even narrates it. But John has it in Jerusalem. So for me, I don't know what's going on there. I think someone did change it intentionally. I don't know what the reason would be for it. Maybe they changed it to Galilee would be because that's where the bulk of Jesus' ministry was. I don't know. We can only speculate, but
yeah, I appreciate you being honest about this stuff. I think we need to be honest about this stuff right then and there. But again, I think also the literary devices do help with this. If you're trying to improve the narrative flow, it makes sense for Matthew and Mark to do this. Whereas Luke and John found other ways, like Luke just clearly compresses. John, I think, is just mentioning more of the chaos of the whole thing because he's just this is his reportage aspect. He's writing, he's remembering things as best as he can. So that kind of aspect. So, all right, let's play a little more of this.
Did the disciples believe these men? What happened at the appearance? Did Jesus stay on earth for a while? You go through these things, they cannot be reconciled. No scholar, no Bible scholar has been able to write a coherent narrative to explain just basically what happened.
Well, again, I think Dan is just wrong here. You can explain a coherent narrative. You first admit there's issues here, like as you've done, and then once we employ literary devices and know they were used in the cultural context, what's the issue? I mean, you would expect authors to do this. We see, as you mentioned, with the assassination of Caesar, the issues there. Same thing with the resurrection narratives.
Yep, and same thing with Caesar weeping about Alexander. It was in Spain, but when was it? And, was it during his quaestorship or his praetorship? Was it at 69, 68 BC, or was it in 62 BC? Was it because he saw the statue or read something that Alexander? I don't know. But he wept because he recognized that when Alexander was his age, he'd accomplished a whole lot more in life than Caesar had at that point. That's what's
important. The Bible is a contradictory mishmash. It has some truth in it. It would be surprising if it didn't. But it contradicts history. You saw the report out of Tel Aviv last month about camels. It has now been pinpointed just about to the decade in the 9th century BC when domesticated camels were introduced into the Middle East. We know that now. Historians and scholars know that. Archaeologists know that. And yet, the Old Testament describes the patriarchs of about a millennium earlier having domesticated camels and camel caravans. That didn't happen. That was a mistake. That was an anachronism. It was wrong. The Bible is filled with all...
All right, so that's basically the last thing I think need to be addressed. There's no more points in this after this, but let me address this whole camel thing here really quickly. So this is probably the study you're referring to out of Tel Aviv. The introduction of domestic camels into the southern Levant, evidence from the Arava Valley. I probably butchered that. But so this is just looking at one specific area and local Canaanites. Abraham was not a local Canaanite. And we see that actually camels were domesticated in other areas long before this. So like in Arabia, the Bactrian camel was domesticated in Iran shortly after that. We see camels are mentioned in Iranian sources, camels are mentioned in Sumerian sources, camels are mentioned in Akkadian sources. Here's a depiction of people riding a camel. Like, kind of hard to look at it, but you see the second set of legs there from the left. People are sitting on a camel there, this kind of thing. There's also an inscription in Egypt where someone clearly has a domesticated camel. Now here's a simple explanation. If Abraham, who wasn't from Canaan, moved there, and there was domestication of camels all around that area, is it possible? I don't know, like maybe. I'm just throwing this out here. Maybe people moved between Mesopotamia and Egypt, and they had camels at times, even though the Canaanites didn't actually have camels themselves. And also, the Bible says Abraham, when he first got camels, the first time it mentions, it says that Pharaoh gave him camels while he was in Egypt. It doesn't say he found them in Canaan. So this just seems to be, again, not really looking at the data properly and turning a molehill into a mountain. The Bible never says the Canaanites had camels. What'd you say there?
That's a good pickup, Mike.
Yeah. So this is what I mean. You manufacture objections out of nothing burgers. It's not really there. So, anything you want to say about the resurrection accounts, the appearances, before we get to super chats? Anything you want to add about them? Again, I think it's very honest for you to especially admit, yeah, there are problems here. We need to be honest and stop pretending they're not. But we also need to be honest. These can be. There are ways to harmonization, like I mentioned in that graphic. And then I think there's simpler ways to deal with it, just using literary devices. Anything you want to say on that before we move on?
Yeah, I guess I'd just say what we find in the resurrection narratives in terms of the differences is no different than what you find in a lot of other ancient history. I mean, just take, for example, the burning of Rome. Paul Meyer, the classicist, points this out in his book, In the Fullness of Time. When the burning of Rome happened, where was